September 15th, 1916. The quiet town of Tilwell, England awoke to the whirl of machinery and the clank of metal. Inside its vast factory halls, thousands of workers labored with relentless precision, forging the tools of modern destruction. Each shell they produced was more than steel and powder. It was the distilled power of the Industrial Revolution itself. Across the channel, one of these shells slid into the cold chamber of an artillery gun. A thunderous blast followed, and the weapon's roar hurled its payload high above the horizon. What went up was not just a projectile, it was a symbol of a new age. An age where machines, not men, dictated the rhythm of war. The industrial world had given humanity unmatched power, but with it came an equally unmatched capacity for death. The factories of Chilwell and countless others were no longer serving peace and progress. They were fueling the greatest slaughter Europe had ever known. This was no longer war as Napoleon had waged it. This was something different, something terrifying. The birth of industrialized warfare. A machine that once started would be almost impossible to stop. The Industrial Revolution was more than an age of invention. It was a force that tore humanity from the rhythms of the past and hurled it into a new world. For centuries, life had followed the cycle of the seasons. Farmers sowed, harvested, and rested as their ancestors had done for generations. But steam shattered that rhythm. The heartbeat of machines replaced the heartbeat of nature. Coal and iron gave birth to factories, and those factories demanded armies of workers. Millions left the quiet countryside and crowded into swelling cities, their lives bound not to the land, but to the unrelenting schedule of the machine. For the first time in history, muscle power was eclipsed by machine power. Goods poured out on a scale no one could have imagined. This revolution did not stop at the workshop floor. It surged through the halls of government. Nations that embraced industry grew rich, powerful, and, most importantly, capable of controlling their populations with unprecedented reach. Bureaucracies expanded, railways tied nations together. Steam power was no longer just an engine of progress, it was an engine of power. The world had changed forever, and soon war itself would be changed beyond recognition. The Industrial Revolution handed nations weapons of unimaginable power, but generals were slow to grasp what it meant. At the dawn of the 19th century, Napoleon had already harnessed the might of the state to raise massive armies, reshaping Europe through sheer numbers. Yet, as the decades passed, many rulers tried to retreat into tradition. They preferred smaller, loyal forces, clinging to the comfort of the past while the world surged forward. Military planners eyed new technologies, rifled muskets, railroads, steamships, with suspicion. They were costly, untested, and disruptive to the old order. Why abandon proven tactics when cavalry charges and disciplined lines had carried armies to glory for centuries? But industry was relentless. Each year brought fresh inventions. Each factory line churned out new possibilities of destruction. And while commanders debated in gilded halls, the battlefield was already being reshaped without them. The fist of industry was tightening around the art of war. Tradition could delay the future, but it could not stop it. The moment was coming when generals would have no choice but to adapt, or see their men slaughtered by weapons they failed to understand. The age of industrialized warfare was no longer a question. It was inevitable. Between 1853 and 1865, the world witnessed a terrifying preview of what industry would bring to the battlefield. In the Crimean War, the thunder of modern artillery shattered the old illusions of glory. At Sevastopol, entire landscapes were torn apart by explosive shells. Soldiers faced not just enemies, but the raw power of mechanized fire. Death came faster, louder, and more merciless than ever before. Across the Atlantic, the American Civil War revealed the same grim truth. At Gettysburg, lines of men marched bravely into a storm of rifled muskets and artillery, only to be cut down in staggering numbers. Cavalry charges, once the pride of armies, crumbled before disciplined rifle fire. By the war's end, trenches scarred the land, a foreshadowing of what would soon engulf all of Europe. These wars were not just conflicts, they were warnings. The old ways of fighting could not survive the new weapons forged by industry. But too many leaders refused to listen. What emerged from Crimea and Gettysburg was a roadmap. The world was heading toward a new kind of conflict, one where machines and factories would decide the fate of nations. A storm was gathering, and it would not be ignored. While battlefields on land were being reshaped by rifles and artillery, the seas were undergoing a revolution of their own. For centuries, wooden ships powered by sails had ruled the oceans. But the age of industry brought steam, and with it, a new kind of warship. No longer dependent on the wind, fleets could maneuver with ruthless precision, striking when and where they chose. The shift grew even more dramatic in 1853, when Russian ships armed with explosive shells annihilated an Ottoman fleet in the Black Sea. The message was clear. Old wooden navies were helpless before the firepower of industrial weapons. The race was on. Nations rushed to build stronger guns, faster steamships, and, most importantly, armor. Within a decade, ironclad warships took the stage. Their arrival was cemented during the American Civil War, when the Union's Monitor and the Confederacy's Virginia clashed at Hampton Roads. For hours, the two iron giants pounded each other, neither giving way. The battle ended without a victor, but the lesson was undeniable. Wood was obsolete, and armor was the future. From that day forward, the seas would never look the same. The Industrial Revolution had claimed the oceans and transformed naval warfare forever. On land, the Industrial Revolution struck at the very heart of traditional warfare. For centuries, the thunder of cavalry charges had decided battles. But now, new weapons were rewriting the rules. Rifling carved grooves into musket barrels, sending bullets farther and straighter than ever before. Breech-loading rifles followed, allowing soldiers to reload in seconds from behind cover. Accuracy increased 30-fold. What once took decades to arm an army could now be achieved in just a few years, as factories churned out rifles by the millions. The consequences were devastating. Cavalry, once the pride of generals, became almost useless, cut down long before their sabers could reach the enemy. Artillery, too, was reborn. Steel, breech-loaded cannons fired faster, farther, and more accurately. Light enough to move quickly, yet powerful enough to shatter defenses, they became the kings of the battlefield. Defenders now held all the cards. Charging into rifle fire and massed artillery was no longer bravery. It was suicide. Yet commanders clung to tradition, ordering frontal assaults that ended in slaughter. The battlefield had changed forever. The age of heroic charges was dead. In its place stood the grim reality of industrial firepower, a storm no army could ignore. If rifles and artillery reshaped the battlefield, the railroad reshaped the entire war. For centuries, armies had marched on foot, their pace limited by exhaustion and supply wagons. But the iron rails of the Industrial Revolution shattered that limitation. Trains could carry men, weapons, and food 15 times faster than marching, delivering entire armies to the front in days instead of months. Prussia was the first to see the potential. In 1846, it moved 12,000 soldiers by rail, a feat unimaginable just decades earlier. During the American Civil War, the industrial North harnessed its vast railway networks to outmaneuver and outlast the South. By 1870, Prussia again demonstrated mastery, deploying nearly 500,000 men to the French border in only 18 days. But railroads carried more than soldiers. They carried the factories themselves. Weapons built hundreds of miles away now flowed endlessly to the front. Civilians and workers far from the battlefield were suddenly part of the war effort. This was the birth of total war, where entire nations, not just armies, were mobilized for conflict. No longer was war confined to the soldier's sword or rifle. Every factory, every farmer, every citizen became a cog in the machine of destruction. As Europe's factories roared to life, their weapons did not remain confined to the continent. Instead, they were carried outward into Africa, Asia, and beyond. Colonial empires became the testing grounds for industrial firepower. Here, the imbalance was staggering. European armies, armed with rifles, artillery, and the terrifying new machine gun, faced opponents who often carried little more than spears or outdated muskets. Battles that once might have lasted days were reduced to minutes of one-sided slaughter. At Omdurman in 1898, British forces, armed with Maxim guns, cut down tens of thousands of Sudanese fighters, suffering only a fraction of the losses themselves. Steamships carried these armies across oceans, while railroads drove their conquests deep inland. Industrial war made empire not just possible, but inevitable. Colonies became both markets for manufactured goods and sources of raw materials to fuel even greater production. But in conquering the world, Europe was also preparing for something far darker. The weapons perfected abroad would soon return home. When the great powers finally turned their guns on each other, the devastation would be unlike anything the world had ever seen. The age of easy victories was ending. The age of industrial slaughter was about to begin. In 1914, Europe marched to war with bright uniforms, polished boots, and confidence that the fighting would be over by Christmas. What awaited them instead was the full horror of industrialized warfare. Trenches stretched from the Alps to the English Channel, a steel scar across the continent. Barbed wire snarled the earth, machine guns poured out endless streams of fire, and artillery shells rained down day and night. A single bombardment could erase entire battalions in seconds. The defenders had every advantage. Cavalry was swept aside, and frontal assaults became nothing more than mass graves. At Verdun, at the Somme, hundreds of thousands perished for a few yards of ground. The machine age had turned battlefields into slaughterhouses. Industry supplied it all. Factories worked without rest, producing rifles, shells, and poison gas by the millions. Railroads fed the trenches with endless supplies of men and material. Even the skies were transformed. Airplanes buzzed overhead, first spotting targets, then dropping bombs on cities. Tanks rumbled forward, unreliable but terrifying, a glimpse of wars to come. This was not war of heroics. It was war of endurance, won not by brilliance in battle, but by the side that could outproduce, outlast, and outbleed the other. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, the world was unrecognizable. Tens of millions were dead, entire empires lay in ruins, and the myths of glory and war had been buried beneath mud and steel. The First World War was not won by daring charges or brilliant generals. It was won in the factories, in the mines, and on the railways. Industry had tipped the scales of history. The legacy was clear. Modern war would never again be fought by soldiers alone. Every worker, every machine, every resource of a nation became part of the battlefield. Civilians were no longer bystanders, they were targets, as total war blurred the line between home and front. The lesson carried forward, from the tank divisions of World War II to the nuclear arms race to today's precision drones and satellite-guided weapons, the pattern remains the same. Each technological leap extends the reach of destruction while pushing the human cost higher. From Chilwell's factory floor to the trenches of the Somme to the skies over Ukraine today, the shadow of industrial war still hangs over us. The question is no longer whether machines will shape war. The question is how far humanity will let them lead us. The story of modern warfare is not just a tale of battles and weapons. It is the story of humanity itself, pushed to its breaking point. From muddy trenches and roaring artillery to the blinding flash of the atomic age, each step has reshaped the world forever. These wars were not fought only on distant battlefields, but in the hearts, homes, and factories of entire nations. And though the weapons have grown ever more powerful, the cost has always been measured in human lives. This is the legacy of war, one that still shadows our world today.